The TeraFlex coilover bracket kit for the JT Gladiator makes it possible to run Falcon 3.3 coilover shocks on both the front and the rear of your Gladiator. In this video, we'll show you the full installation process step by step so you can install it yourself. You will need some welding experience to install the axle brackets, but we've designed this kit to make the process as smooth and straightforward as possible. This video assumes that you will be installing on a stock vehicle that has no previous modifications, but if you are watching this video, we should also assume that you are contemplating installing this kit on your own Jeep, so it's more than likely that your vehicle will have some modifications done to it. To install the TeraFlex coilover brackets, it is required that you have long arms on your vehicle, which can be installed in tandem with the coilover bracket kit. This kit is designed to be installed using TeraFlex's axles. Because of their thicker axle tubes and upgraded housing, they are ideal to handle the change to coilover shocks. However, brackets for the Rubicon 44 axle are also available, but a 44 axle will require wheel spacers. Included in the written instructions is a guide to determine how much wheel spacer will be needed, depending on your axle width, wheel offset, and tire width. Your inside tire to inside tire width must be 58.5 inches or greater. Installing coilover shocks onto your Jeep is a big job and requires a lot of time. It is highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety and read the written instructions thoroughly before starting the installation process. If you have any questions about what has been said already or the process going forward, please reach out to the TeraFlex customer service team. To remove the axles, lift the vehicle off the ground and remove the tires. If you have rock sliders, like you see in the video here, then you can use those as lift points. If you are installing the long arm brackets at the same time, then avoid using body mounts for this install. Remove the front sway bar links, these will be replaced. Disconnect the front track bar from the axle. If you are replacing it, then feel free to remove it. Disconnect the drag link from the knuckle. If you don't already have an HD drag link, you can remove the drag link entirely. Remove the front brake calipers and hang them off to the side. Don't hang them by the brake line. Remove the rotor. Stock rotors have a small bolt holding it in place. Remove the backing plate. Disconnect the ABS sensor. Remove the bracket connecting the ABS line to the top of the knuckle. Disconnect the axle actuator plug on the right side of the axle. Detach the wires anywhere they connect to the axle. If you have electronic lockers, then you will also need to disconnect the locker actuator plug. Disconnect the vent hose. Support the axle and remove the front shocks. Remove and discard the brake line brackets from the lower control arms and spring mounts by first prying open the bracket and carefully removing the brake lines. Then detach and discard the brackets. Remove the front drive shaft. This will need to be replaced. The front upper control arms are covered by a heat shield on the frame end. Feel free to move this out of the way and remove it entirely. Loosen the bolts on the control arms. Lower the axle enough to remove the springs. Double check to make sure all brake lines, ABS lines, sensors, hoses, and plugs are disconnected from the front axle and control arms. To remove the axle, we will lower it down onto the table, which has wheels so we can move the table around. If you don't have a table like we do, then you can use jack stands. Remove the lower arms from both the axle and the frame. Disconnect the upper arms from the axle. At this point, the axle is disconnected, so the vehicle can be lifted up, or the axle moved out of the way if you're not using a lift. Remove the upper control arms from the frame end. On the passenger side of vehicles with an e-torque, there is an auxiliary coolant pump which will need to be moved out of the way to access the bolt. Installing coilover brackets onto the axles requires that you cut off certain factory brackets. This is best done with a plasma cutter, but a cutoff wheel or body saw will also get the job done. On the front Rubicon axle, cut off the spring mount bracket and then the shock mount bracket. The axle tube needs to be smooth to attach new coilover brackets. Make sure that the axle's powder coat is removed from the areas where you will be welding. If you have TeraFlex's axles, then you will need to remove the same brackets on the front and rear, but the installation of the new rear brackets will be a little different. To install the front shock brackets, on the driver's side, attach the alignment bracket to the sway bar link mount, where it aligns with the underside of the mount. Attach the alignment brackets to the track bar mount on the passenger side. It will be flush along the top with the top of the track bar bracket. Set the shock bracket into place on the passenger side. A notch on the bracket positions it correctly to the alignment bracket. The alignment bracket should be nested against the outside of the notch. On the front Rubicon axles, the welds on the knuckle might prevent the bracket from sitting flat. If this is the case, you can grind a little off the bracket until it sits flat. Tack the shock bracket into place and double check that it is sitting correctly on the axle tube. If everything looks good, weld the bracket on completely. Repeat the process for the driver's side. The alignment bracket will line up with the outside of the notch on the bracket. When you switch sides, make sure you move the ground so it is on the same side that you are welding. Do not allow the ground to go through the carrier. After both shock brackets are welded on, you can install the bump stop brackets. These go on top of the axle exactly 90 degrees from the track bar bracket. On Rubicon axles, the brackets sit 2 inches in from the knuckle. On Terra 60 axles, these will be 2 5/16 from the knuckle. It is important that these sit correctly on the axle so the TeraFlex speed bump can properly absorb the bump. Tack the bracket on and double check everything is located correctly. If it's good, then weld on the bracket. Once you have all the axle brackets welded on and they have cooled properly, prime and paint the axles using good etching primer and a few coats of black enamel paint. Start by removing all the clips, connectors, brackets, wire harnesses, and plugs that attach to the shock tower, spring bucket, and inner frame behind the shock tower and spring bucket. This is no small venture, and we suggest you take a picture of your vehicle prior to removing anything so that you can more or less figure out where it went. The hardware on the brake line bracket will need to be saved for use later, as will the hardware for the bracket holding the large plug. Tie up all the loose wires out of the way. On the back of the steering pump are 2 plugs that need to be disconnected. Unbolt the steering pump from the frame and push it back. On the driver's side, loosen the steering box bolts in front of the spring bucket and remove the bolts inside the spring bucket. These bolts will be replaced with new hardware, but retain the factory bolts because you will reuse them in different locations with the coilover brackets. If you have a diesel or 392, you will need to remove the airbox. The airboxes for the two trims are different, but they pretty much are removed the same way, even though stuff is in different places. Disconnect the plug and loosen the clamp. And remove the bolts holding it in place. Then lift it straight up. You need to trim the rearmost corner of the airbox. The diesel has a cover that adheres to the airbox to cover up the trimmed corner. While you have the airbox removed, remove the airbox mounting bracket by disconnecting the clips and removing the bolts. Cut off the rear half of the bracket just behind the second rubber mount, as indicated on the screen. Smooth over any sharp corners and paint the exposed metal. Reinstall the front of the bracket onto the vehicle and discard the rear section, then reinstall the trimmed airbox. If you are cutting off the front shock tower and the spring mount with a plasma torch, cover any remaining brake lines and wire harnesses that could not be moved entirely out of the way with soaking wet rags. Cut carefully and use a metal backing plate to prevent sparks from going into the engine bay. Doing it in stages is helpful and makes it easier to get tools in behind the spring bucket. You only need to cut the spring bucket until it is flush with the outside of the frame. Nothing mounts up there in the hole of the bucket, it will be hidden behind the coilover bracket. But if you desire a cleaner look, you can remove this section on top of the frame. Just be extra careful to not cut into the brake lines. Grind away the remaining metal from the brackets. The outside face of the frame should be smooth. Starting on the inside of the passenger side of the frame, place the provided template over the existing holes. Mark the size of the top hole and remove the template. On Gladiators with a 3.6 liter V6, part of the motor mount needs to be trimmed to allow the template to fit into place. Measure up 3/4 inch from the lowest point on the inside of the bracket. Trim this off and grind it smooth. You might need to trim a little more once the hole is drilled out. Drill out the bottom hole to 3/4 inch. It's too tight to fit a drill up to drill out the other hole, so using a rotary tool to enlarge the hole to the sizes you've marked using the template is a better option. Once the first two existing holes are opened up to 3/4 inch, replace the template and mark the center of the third hole. Drill this out in steps to 7/8 inch. If there's not enough room to use longer drill bits, the rotary tool can be used again once the pilot hole is drilled out. Test fit the inner bracket and adjust the holes as needed. Set the coilover bracket into place using the 2 bolts on the right to hold it up. Align the small hole on the bottom corner with the hole in the frame. Then mark the center of the 2 holes on the frame. Before you remove the frame, make sure the hole that you marked with the template is in the correct location. Remove the bracket and drill all 3 holes. The hole you marked with the template goes to a 1/2 inch. The other 2 holes are drilled to 11/16 inch. This process is the same for both the driver and the passenger side. Install the passenger bracket. Remember the 2 bolts you removed from the steering box? One of them is going to slide into the inner bracket from the inside of the frame. Use the provided hardware to attach the rest of the bracket. A flag nut is installed through the large hole found rearward from the bracket. If your vehicle is 2023 or newer, you will need to remove the small bit of tire deflector bracket that covers the large hole on the passenger side. Place the small bolt in from the back of the coilover bracket. When we were filming, we failed to slide this in the way that we were supposed to, and so we just loosened all of the bolts and stuck it in while it was on the vehicle. On the driver's side, the outside bracket will install in mostly the same way, except the 2 provided long M12 bolts will go through the frame and into the steering box. The bracket that installs on the inside of the frame will reuse the other factory bolt that was removed from the steering box. 2 nuts will be installed to hold the bracket onto the 2 bolts going through the steering box. Tighten these only after you have tightened the hardware from the outside. The brake line bracket will attach to the bracket using tiny bolts installed from behind the bracket. On the passenger side, the wire harness attaches to the bracket in 2 locations. Reuse the hardware you removed from the shock tower and the brake line bracket. You will need to heat up and bend the plastic piece where it attaches to the bracket. Attach the breather hose to the driver bracket using the button head zip ties. Install the speed bumps by applying RTV silicone to the speed bump body, slide it into the tube, and attach the clamp on top. Clean off any silicone that got pushed off during installation. Attach the coilover speed bump spacers onto the axle bracket, the spacer configuration will be different depending on the tire sizes your vehicle will have. A tire clearance guide is included in the written instructions. Reinstall the axles onto the vehicle. Reinstall the rest of the components in the RT long arm suspension system or any aftermarket components that connect to the axle. Install the Falcon coilover shocks. The installation is pretty straightforward. Attach the shock top and bottom using the hardware provided with the brackets. The front brake lines need to be swapped from one side to the other. This prevents the brake lines from stretching too far and getting caught in the coilover springs. Clamp the brake lines and disconnect them from the brake calipers. Disconnect the other end of the one brake line and transfer it quickly to the other side. If you have a friend to put their thumb on the brake line while you swap these lines, then that will prevent you from losing brake fluid. Make sure you place the crush washers whenever you disconnect a brake line from the caliper. After the first brake line is attached, take the second back to the other side and attach it. Install the brake line anchor using hardware that was included with the coilover bracket. The anchor brackets are included with the RT long arm suspension system. Attach the anchor brackets to the ABS line and the brake line. The brake and ABS line should go behind the coilover shock and not touch the spring. You will need to bleed the brakes. Detailed instructions for a manual brake bleed can be found in the written instructions. To remove the rear axle from the vehicle, start by disconnecting the brake line bracket on the frame. Remove the rear drive line. It helps if the vehicle is in neutral. There's a middle support that gets removed as well. The Gladiator we used for this section of the video had a short arm RT3 kit already installed. Disconnect the brake line bracket from the axle. Pull down on the parking brake and use locking pliers to hold the eyelet in place. Unhook the parking brake wire. Push down on the 3 tabs and detach the parking brake line from the axle. Disconnect the plug if you have lockers and detach the breather hose. Support the axle and remove the shocks. Remove the track bar. This Gladiator already has the HD track bar and relocation brackets installed, but you won't need to remove the relocation bracket if you also have it installed. The factory rear sway bar is not compatible with the coilover kits, so we recommend our JT forged ST rear sway bar, which is relocated from the axle to the frame and includes longer sway bar links. Since that kit already has its own video, let's just say here to remove the factory rear sway bar. Lower the axle onto the table or jack stands and disconnect the rear arms from the axle. There's probably some other stuff you need to do if you're installing long arms at the same time, but that is all you need to do to install the coilover brackets. Installing the rear axle brackets is a relatively simple process. On the rear axles, cut off the shock mounts and smooth out the tube. The same axle brackets are used for OEM Rubicon axles and TeraFlex axles. If you are installing the brackets onto a TeraFlex axle, then you will need to hammer in the tabs on the section that goes around the axle tube. TeraFlex axles have a larger 3¼ inch tube. The installation is otherwise the same for the OEM Rubicon 44 axles and TeraFlex's 44 and 60 axles. Do not hammer in the tabs if you are installing these brackets on an OEM Rubicon axle. Attach the alignment tabs to the threaded hole on the brake line mounts that is attached to the bump stop strike pad. There are 2 little holes on the tab to line up with the 2 little holes on either side of the threaded hole. Set the bracket into place using the alignment tab to align the inner side of the bracket. It should be pushed up firmly on both sides. Mark the areas where the bracket will be welded to the tube. Remove the powder coat from these areas. Tack the bracket onto the axle and double check its position. Remove the alignment tab and cut the brake line mount off the bump stop strike pad. Clean up the sharp edges. Since this permanently removes what you need to align the bracket, make sure the bracket is positioned correctly before you remove it. Weld the bracket on the outside and as much on the inside as you can reach. If you use a smaller welding tip, then you should be able to get quite a bit of it. Set the reinforcement bracket into place. Use a bolt to align the holes. Weld the reinforcement to the larger bracket and also to the tube. Once it has cooled, paint the axle using a quality etching primer and many layers of black enamel paint. In preparation for the rear brackets, the rear section of the exhaust will need to be removed. The process shown here is for vehicles with a 3.6 liter V6. Vehicles with a diesel have a slightly different process and also include removing the DEF tank. Detailed instruction for this is given in the written instructions. Detach the 3 rear exhaust mounts and loosen the clamp that attaches to the front section of the exhaust. The rear section of the exhaust can now be removed. Remove the exhaust heat shield. Disconnect the vapor lines from the canister by removing the clips and pushing the buttons. Be very careful not to break these. Take off the hardware and remove the vapor canister from the vehicle. Disconnect the fuel line mounting brackets from the cross member that run under the frame. This will look a little different on diesel vehicles. Remove the 6 bed bolts. Lift up on only one side of the bed at a time. Place a wooden block to hold the bed up. You might need a friend for this. Push wires and lines away from the shock mount and cover them with wet rags. Using a plasma torch or a cutoff wheel, cut the shock mount brackets off the frame. Use a grinder to smooth out the frame. Switch to the other side of the vehicle and cut off the other bracket. Make sure you lower the bed on the first side before lifting it on the other side. After removing the second bracket, lower the bed back down onto the frame. Temporarily install the coilover bracket using the bed mount bolt on the underside. Use a punch to mark the location on the frame of the 3 holes that will need to be drilled out. For the holes that go on the inside of the frame, cut out the provided template. Yours won't be green. Attach it to the frame using tape. Mark where to drill the 2 new holes with a punch. Drill the holes into the frame in steps or using a step bit. The outside holes need to be 9/16 inch and the inside holes need to be 1 inch to fit the sleeves. Test fit things as you go. Prime and paint the exposed metal. Set the bracket into place, this time without the bed bolt. Insert the 2 long bolts into the outer holes first and then push in the sleeves from the inside. If you put the sleeves in first, sometimes things won't quite line up right. For the short bolt that goes in the middle, you will use a flag nut. Tie a string to the flag nut. That's why the little hole is there. Normally stuff like this is a recommendation, but not this time. The last thing you want to do is drop the flag nut down into the frame. It is really hard to get out. Trust me, just tie the string on. Reinstall the bed bolts using blue thread locker and final tighten all the hardware bracket. Reinstall the axle. If you are installing long arms at the same time, the installation of those will need to be finished at this point. Before installing the Falcon Coilover Shocks, install the spacer sleeve on the frame side of the upper eyelet. Install the shock using the hardware that is included with the coilover brackets. Make sure the reservoir points towards the rear of the vehicle. Some Gladiators, from the first few years they were available, do not come with reinforcement plates on the rear bump stops. If they are not present, then weld on the reinforcement plates that come with the bump stop reinforcement kit. The reinforcement spacer gets installed from the inside of the frame and replaces the nut that would be used on the cup spacers. Install the bump stop cup spacers and Falcon foam bump stops. The strike pad reinforcement goes underneath the plastic bump stop spacer and simply uses the bump stop spacer hardware. Now that the coilover installation is complete, throw on those 40s and then hit the trail in comfort and style, knowing your Gladiator is ready to take on just about anything you point it at. Within reason, of course.